I'd like to welcome everybody. Welcome to not quite our last session of the season. We do have an upcoming program here on June 30 with Geopolitics with Granieri. But I welcome you to this today's book talk with our senior fellow Dom Tierney. Dom is both a senior fellow at FPRI and an associate professor of political science at Swarthmore College, and contributing, is it writer or editor?
Just editor now.
Contributing editor of The Atlantic magazine, where he writes periodically. He is the author of 4 books. We're here to discuss his latest book, The Right Way to Lose a War, which I would only note includes a chapter called The Right Way to Win a War, in case you imagine other things. His last book, How We Fight, Crusades, Quagmires, and the American Way of War, was a phenomenal book. This, too, I'm about halfway through it. It is also a phenomenal book. I have a habit of, when I find an arresting observation or quote, or something that I would like to quote in the future, I always write Q in the margin so I can set it aside for the future. I already have about 6 Qs in just the first half of the book, so there are a lot of arresting observations. In fact, Jim Kurth, my colleague here, our distinguished senior fellow, has already told me that if every president read this book, or would-be president, this country would be in much better shape. So now there is a website called Rate My Professors, which I don't really consult because I don't put a lot of credence in it, but I did happen to run by it when I Googled Dom, and I saw that it averages the scores on various qualities. On easiness, on a scale of 1 to 5, he's only a 3. So this is not going to be easy. But on clarity, he's a 4.9. So you're going to hear a crystal clear lecture. But the running motif through these student evaluations was put best by one student who said, "The accent is to die for." So please welcome Dom Tierney.
As always, Alan is far too kind. Of course, I would never take advantage of my accent for selfish purposes. Alan and FPRI have long been strong supporters of mine, and I'm extremely grateful for that support, not just for this book, but also for previous projects and hopefully future projects as well. So I'm going to talk for about 25-30 minutes about some of the themes in the book, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion. So I'm going to talk in very broad brushstrokes rather than a lot of detail, so feel free to ask about anything that you are curious about. The key questions that guide the book are, why has America stopped winning wars? How can we end a deteriorating war? And, as Alan mentioned, how can we return to the path of victory? These questions are incredibly important for the lives of American soldiers, for the future of countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, for America's reputation abroad, for domestic politics here at home, for the careers of presidents, really for all of us. These are critical, essential questions. We live in the age of unwinnable conflicts. That is the subtitle of the book, where decisive victory is often proved to be a pipe dream. So up until 1945, the United States won almost every war that it fought against Mexico, the Confederacy, Spain, Germany, Japan. And then all of a sudden, the United States stopped winning wars. The Korean War in the 1950s evolved into a very tough stalemate at a cost of 37,000 American lives. In Vietnam, the US faced outright military defeat for the first time in its history. The British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan once said that the rule number 1 in politics was, quote, never invade Afghanistan. Well, in 2001, the US ignored that injunction and very quickly overthrew the Taliban regime in Kabul. The Taliban fled south, but the war was not over. And in fact, the Taliban soon recovered, and this set the stage for today's stalemated conflict. An even bleaker tale played out in Iraq, where the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime triggered disorder, the collapse of civil unrest, and really full-scale civil war. During the last 7 decades, the Gulf War in 1991 is the only clear American success in major war. In terms of victory, we are 1 for 5. We live in an era of protracted war. In fact, the 3 longest conflicts in American history have all happened in this dark age of American warfare: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Or think of what are the most resonant images of conflict. Right? If you cast your mind back to the sort of golden age of American warfare, you might think of storming the beach at D-Day, something like this, raising the flag on Iwo Jima. But think about more recent decades. What are the resonant images of war? You would think of naked prisoners being abused at Abu Ghraib, or helicopters lifting personnel, South Vietnamese Americans off rooftops. So why does the United States struggle on the battlefield? Well, the answer is most fundamentally a combination of American power and a changed battlefield environment. So after 1945, the United States bestrode the world like a colossus, as the unsurpassed superpower. But this newfound strength created a constant temptation to use force and projected American troops into distant conflicts. Washington, however, chose an unfortunate moment to discover its inner interventionist, because the nature of global warfare changed after World War II, from conflicts between countries, or interstate wars, to conflicts within countries, or civil wars. So the good news here is that countries have largely stopped fighting each other due to a number of different factors: nuclear deterrence, the spread of democracy, globalization, and trade. The bad news is that insurgents didn't get the memo about the end of war. Nuclear weapons, democracy, trade, these might stop countries from invading each other, but they don't stop civil wars from breaking out. Instead, the end of the European colonial empires in the 50s, 60s, 70s, then later the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and then later still, more recently, the Arab Spring, all triggered a spike in internal conflict. So today, about 90% of wars are civil wars. In fact, just look around the world. All the most prominent conflicts are civil wars: Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Gaza, Nigeria, Ukraine. Interestingly, civil wars are also the main arena for state competition. So countries no longer invade each other very often, but instead they compete by meddling in civil wars like Syria and Ukraine and backing rival factions. For the United States, foreign civil wars have become a major security challenge, causing humanitarian crises, refugee flows, terrorism. During the last 20 years, America has arguably been threatened less by strong states than by failing states. So what was the result of this shift in the nature of war from conventional conflict to civil wars and guerrilla fighting? Well, for the United States, it created an era of unwinnable conflict. Washington ended up intervening in distant and culturally alien places that it did not understand. In Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, we are strangers in a strange land. We don't comprehend the local geography, religions, ethnic politics, or languages. Just to give you one indicator, in 2006, there were 1,000 American officials in the US Embassy in Baghdad. Only 6 of them were fluent in Arabic. There's another problem. For a global hegemon like the United States, which faces many different security challenges around the world, each individual conflict is just one of many different commitments. But for the enemy that the US fights, that conflict is a life and death struggle that occupies its entire attention. What that means is that it's limited war for us, but total war for our adversary. We have more power, the enemy has more willpower. The US military also failed to adapt to this new era of civil wars and guerrilla conflict. Up until 1945, there was a kind of template for the US way of war, whereby the United States routinely crushed enemy countries with a combination of high explosives, technology, and big unit warfare. After World War II, the United States tried the same tactics, essentially the same template, against insurgents, with free fire zones, enemy kill counts. William Westmoreland was once asked for the secret to defeating the insurgency in Vietnam. He gave a one-word answer: firepower. But these tactics proved disastrous in civil wars, where indiscriminate firepower may just cause collateral damage and lose hearts and minds. Whereas the United States failed to adjust to the new era of war, guerrillas proved to be far more adaptive. They raised their game, seizing the banner of nationalism, forming networks with other rebel groups, devising innovative tactics to offset American power. Today, the Taliban in Afghanistan survives on estimated revenues of about $250 million per year. Just to put that in perspective, the University of Pennsylvania's annual budget is close to $6 billion. In other words, the University of Pennsylvania could fund about 25 Taliban insurgencies. The Taliban, however, compensated by trading information with Iraqi rebel groups on improvised explosive devices. So since 1945, 4 out of 5 major American wars became unwinnable, whereby decisive victory was off the table. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Time and again, after the mission deteriorated, Washington struggled to cut the nation's losses and find an honorable peace. In other words, we're good at getting in, and we're bad at getting out. President Obama said, "I think Americans have learned that it's harder to end wars than it is to begin them." In Korea, for instance, we spent 2 years negotiating a truce, even as brutal attritional fighting continued. In Vietnam, the peace talks lasted for 5 years, with little to show for it. In fact, tragically, the peace terms the US gained in 1973 in Vietnam were actually worse than the terms that North Vietnam had offered back in 1965, 8 years before. In 2003, it took the US 21 days to capture Baghdad. It took us over 3,000 days to leave Baghdad. We seized Kabul in 2001, and of course, we're still there. These flawed exit strategies weakened 4 presidents, Truman, LBJ, Nixon, and Bush, caused enormous damage to American society. So why can't we end these difficult campaigns? Well, one problem is that American presidents go to war usually highly confident of victory, and so they don't plan for the possibility of failure. As a result, when disaster strikes, the US is completely unprepared. The aftermath of battlefield loss is an incredibly difficult environment to navigate in terms of human psychology, public support, the media, alliance politics. Just think of, say, Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, under incredible strain, his presidency unraveling, unable to find a way out of the war. So we must learn how to extricate the country from a quagmire without seeing, crucially, everything we fought for crumble into ashes. Now, to be clear, this is not an easy topic for Americans. The United States is a victory culture. Just consider that every single year, Americans spend $3 billion just on trophies. General Douglas MacArthur famously said, "There is no substitute for victory." And that really taps into a very deep element in American culture. But we're a victory culture that keeps losing wars. And sometimes we do need to find a substitute for victory. Handling military loss may be the ultimate test in all of politics. For 200 years, no American president has ever managed to end his own major failing war. Truman in Korea, LBJ in Vietnam, Bush in Afghanistan and Iraq all ended up handing the problem over to the next guy. So at the moment, we wait until disaster strikes, and then we desperately try to cobble together some sort of withdrawal plan. In other words, we build our fire escape after the blaze has already started. Instead, what we need to do is create the fire escape before the inferno begins. In other words, we need to think about how we would handle failure before the next failure occurs. And so the book outlines a way out of unwinnable wars, an exit strategy called surge, talk, and leave. This is a loose framework designed to be adapted to many different scenarios. Very briefly, following battlefield disaster, the US can surge or temporarily boost capabilities. This is designed to reassert a measure of control and avoid a rout of US and allied troops. In 2007, for instance, Bush announced a surge of forces in Iraq, and a new commander in the form of David Petraeus. These new troops, these new tactics contributed to a striking decline in violence. Then we talk or engage diplomatically with the adversary. There's a deeply ingrained skepticism in American culture about the whole idea of bargaining with evil opponents, especially in wartime. But also you see this with some of the criticism about engaging Iran today. Partly this is because of American power, which means that Americans often don't feel the need to engage adversaries. Surely we can just impose our will. And this skepticism about negotiation also reflects the moralism of American culture, which makes engagement sometimes look like it's sullying our deepest values. In 2003, for example, Paul Wolfowitz received a memo suggesting that the United States reach out to Sunni insurgents in Iraq and stop a full-blown civil war. He returned the memo with 3 words scribbled in the margin: "They are Nazis." But negotiation is a critical part of the exit strategy from war. Engagement can work, for instance, efforts to reach out to Sunni insurgents in 2006, 2007, known as the Awakening Movement, which turned out to be a game changer. And when I interviewed Stanley McChrystal, the US commander in Afghanistan, for the book, one of the interesting things he told me is that we should have started negotiating with the Taliban back in 2003. In other words, when the Taliban was on the run. That was the moment, he said, to reach out and offer the Taliban some sort of place in the new Afghanistan. Instead, we waited almost a decade until US forces were leaving before starting serious negotiations. These talks, by the way, in wartime are astoundingly difficult. Probably many of you know it's tough enough to negotiate buying a new car, right? Imagine trying to negotiate a way out of war with the Korean communists or the Vietnamese insurgents or Sunni guerrillas. These negotiations are often imbued with symbolism. Back in Korea, for example, when the US started negotiating, the Korean communists deliberately gave the American negotiator a really small chair to sit on so that the communists could sort of loom down and look at the American, and the American had to go away and find a chair of normal height. In Vietnam, we spent months arguing over the shape of the negotiating table. Right? Meanwhile, thousands of people are dying in the war. This was actually a critical issue because the question was whether the Viet Cong, the guerrillas in the South, were an independent actor or just a puppet of North Vietnam. So the US said they're just a puppet of the North, therefore let's have a rectangular table with 2 sides because there are 2 sides to the conflict. North Vietnam said absolutely not. The Viet Cong are an independent, indigenous, rising, fighting for freedom. Therefore, let's have a square table with 4 sides to it. Well, in the end, North Vietnam accepted a round table, but now South Vietnam would not sit next to the Viet Cong guerrillas. And so 2 very small square tables were placed at the edge of the round table for secretaries to sit. So there was a little buffer zone between the South and the South representative and the Viet Cong representative. That all took months, right? So that gives you just an idea of how tough it is. It's still, however, necessary. The next stage of surge, talk, and leave is to leave. In other words, at some point, we need to withdraw most US soldiers from the military theater and shift the burden of responsibility to local troops, allies, or an international force. Leaving is an incredibly difficult process. This is what's known as in the military as retrograde, or basically shipping out the little America of bases, Humvees, fast food restaurants, and the flotsam and jetsam of war. It's a logistical nightmare. At this stage, there'll also be a key role for training local security forces. We often see this as the ticket out of war. But as we've seen recently with the Iraqi military fleeing from ISIS, training and advising is a highly vulnerable process, and we've still struggled really to get that right. We also need to swap prisoners of war. This was an extremely controversial issue in Korea and Vietnam. In Korea, the controversy was over the fact that Truman insisted that communist prisoners be allowed to defect to the West. He insisted on that, rather than just doing an all-for-all swap. And the war continued for 15 months on that sole issue, insisting that communists be allowed to defect. In Vietnam, the fate of the 500 or so American prisoners was also a very emotive, controversial issue. And we've seen with Afghanistan, the fate of a single American soldier who was captured, Bo Bergdahl, who was traded for 5 senior Taliban officials, was also a major issue. As we pursue this surge, talk, and leave strategy, the president will need to craft a compelling narrative of the conflict that averts the image of catastrophe. I call this storytelling. We naturally think of war as a story. The reason for this is simple. War, real war, is far too complex for any of us to understand. We just don't understand it. What we can understand is a story about the war. As Walt Whitman put it, the real war will never get into the books. So controlling the narrative of war is an essential part of leadership, an essential part of an exit strategy. Stories are the language of war, and presidents need to speak in terms of stories to be understood. All sorrows can be borne if you put them in a story or tell a story about them. War, in many ways, is a contest to control the narrative. The enemy will certainly propagate its own favored story, which is likely to be a tale of American barbarism. We either write the story of war, or we end up playing the villain in a drama constructed by the adversary. Finally, we will need to handle the aftermath of a difficult war. There will be very many challenges, from healing veterans to preventing the collapse of our allies. But more counterintuitively, the aftermath of a difficult war may also present important opportunities. The withdrawal of US troops, for instance, may cause the enemy alliance to collapse. Sometimes American intervention is the glue that binds the enemy coalition together. Remove the US forces and the glue disintegrates. After we left Vietnam, for example, Communist China and Communist Vietnam went to war with each other. And even if we lose the war, we might be able to win the peace. If you go to Vietnam today, it's full of skyscrapers named after Western corporations, raising the question of who in the long run really won. In the 21st century, the United States and Vietnam may become close allies, bound together by fears of a rising China. The United States has only intervened in Vietnam once. China has invaded Vietnam 17 times. And Hanoi has no fear of looking subservient to Washington. After all, from their perspective, they defeated ours. And military failure can also be a gift that spurs badly needed change. We all learn not by succeeding, but by failing. Baseball teams, for example, you may be interested to know, that do poorly in one season have been statistically shown that they tend to improve the next season. Teams that do well tend to perform less effectively. The reason for this, of course, is that if you do poorly, you adapt and change. If you do well, you tend to become complacent. And the same can be true for nations in war. The experience of difficult campaigns can help the US military learn, reform, and potentially emerge stronger than before. So we should seize the upside of down, taking responsibility for failure and then pivoting to success. So how has Obama done in this environment? Well, how has he performed in the new era of civil wars? His foreign policy is driven in large part by the principle, no more Iraq wars. That was the driving force for his presidency, really. And it has shaped almost every aspect of his foreign policy, the preference for surgical operations, the support for multilateral use of force, the aversion to nation building. And Obama has avoided many Bush-era errors, unilateralism, kind of missionary crusading sentiment, wild overconfidence. His mantra, don't do dumb stuff, does have considerable merit. But there are some problems as well. For instance, one lesson of Iraq is no boots on the ground, no nation building. But it can lead the United States to forget about the day after regime change. And we saw this problem with Libya in 2011, where the US contributed to the overthrow of Gaddafi, but then the US had absolutely no desire to get involved in any kind of post-conflict stabilization. Libya has disintegrated into anarchy and chaos. In fact, Obama explicitly said recently about a lesson he'd learned in Libya, quote, "We and our European partners underestimated the need to come in full force if you're going to do this. Then it's the day after Gaddafi's gone, when everybody is feeling good and everybody is holding up posters saying, 'Thank you, America.' At that moment, there has to be a much more aggressive effort to rebuild societies that didn't have any civic traditions." In a sense, therefore, that lesson was that we overlearned Iraq and the lessons of Iraq. What about Afghanistan? Well, to his credit, Obama broadly followed a surge, talk, and leave strategy in Afghanistan. Surge in 2009-10. We began talks with the Taliban in 2011, withdrew forces from 2011 onwards. But there have also been some serious problems. The surge was too steep and the drawdown too quick. In other words, there was a massive but brief injection of US capabilities. Stanley McChrystal, just to give you a kind of metaphor for this, apparently only eats one meal a day. But it's a 5,000 calorie banquet of burritos and ice cream. And that meal is sort of a symbol for the surge in Afghanistan. This massive injection of capabilities, a tripling of US forces in 2009, 2010, created a kind of sugar high in Afghanistan, which was not really sustainable. I think a smaller but longer surge might have led to somewhat better results. We also waited too long to talk to the Taliban, and Obama has always struggled. For all his supposed skills in rhetoric, he's always struggled to tell a convincing, meaningful story of the war to Americans. What about Iraq? Well, the administration, I think it's fair to say, took its eye off Iraq. From 2009, 2011, Vice President Joe Biden visited Baghdad 7 times. He visited Iraq so frequently that one US general said Biden was eligible for Iraqi citizenship. But since 2011, Biden has never returned to Iraq. And that really captures the sense that the US wanted Maliki to sort of keep Iraq off the front pages, and that was that. So here we are with ISIS. What do we do? Well, there's no easy solution to ISIS. What we've learned in recent years is that almost all of the menu options we have are challenging. So in 2003, we did the big regime change operation, large-scale invasion. That didn't work out very well. So a lesson for that is, okay, let's not get too involved, just surgical operations. Well, that's what we did in Libya in 2011. That didn't go very well. Okay, fine, so let's just rely on sanctions. Let's not use force. Well, that's what we've been doing with Ukraine, and that doesn't seem to have stopped Russian intervention very well. Okay, fine, let's just do nothing. Let's just keep out of it entirely, and that has been essentially the strategy in Syria, and the civil war there has just metastasized into a true human tragedy. Recent US airstrikes since last summer have helped to break ISIS's momentum, but as we've seen recently, they're able to shift from one region to another very effectively, and they captured Ramadi. We should be very wary about major escalation. The biggest proponents of a large-scale US invasion would in fact be ISIS itself. In some ways it would play into their hands. But Obama arguably has been too focused on the day-to-day. I think he's in a kind of holding pattern against ISIS and intends to hand over the problem to the next president. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of a plan for the end game or a real strategy to produce any kind of enduring results. The war against ISIS could be the latest chapter in America's age of unwinnable conflicts. In other words, this campaign may well be unwinnable, that there is no plausible path by which the US would achieve a decisive victory against ISIS. They cannot be destroyed at an acceptable cost because the US-led alliance is deeply divided, ISIS is united and committed, and the insurgents can move their forces between two different civil wars. And yet, even if this war is unwinnable, it may also be necessary. We often see the outcome of war in binary terms. I think this is part of American culture, almost like a sports match, right? Victory, defeat, win, loss. As MacArthur said, there's no substitute for victory. But war is not a sports match with only two results. Instead, there are many gradations of success and failure, from a decisive victory to a partial success, a tough draw, a partial failure, and outright catastrophe. Limited military intervention against ISIS may produce only a marginal success or a tough draw, but this could still represent a better result for US interests than either staying out entirely or sending large numbers of boots on the ground. Fighting ISIS, we may need to find a substitute for victory. So the final part of the book, which I'll end with, as Alan mentioned, is about how we can try to turn around the nation's military fortunes, as well as understanding why we've struggled, and as well as thinking, what do we do when a war becomes a quagmire? An obvious question is, well, can we stop wars from turning into quagmires in the first place and start winning again? How do we adapt to this world of civil wars? Well, to sort of simplify it, we can try to make war safe, legal, and rare. Safe means ensuring adequate training for the kinds of wars that we're actually going to face. And in a world where 90% of wars are civil wars, what that means is civil wars. And so we need to be ready to think in terms of using force to manipulate the outcome of civil conflicts. And that may include peacekeeping, nation building, counterinsurgency, and so on. The problem here is that Washington, the US military, and perhaps the American people more generally don't want to prepare for, don't want to think about, certainly don't want to engage in anything that looks like nation building or stabilization operations. To give you one example, the US military set up the Irregular Warfare Center a few years ago with a very important mission: to institutionalize the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan and teach the principles of counterinsurgency that we'd learned at such grave cost in Iraq and Afghanistan. I would have said that the US military should have tripled funding for the Irregular Warfare Center. Last year they announced that the center was closing. And this is hard to understand in a world where around 90% of wars are civil wars. So we need to make war safe by preparing for the reality of the world that we live in. We can make war legal by fighting according to the rules, gaining congressional authorization, building multilateral support, upholding the rule of law on the battlefield. Fighting lawfully is especially important in these complex civil wars, politically divisive campaigns. And then rare means fighting fewer wars. The truth is that the United States is too quick to seize the sword. We've fought 5 major wars since World War II. 2 of those 5, Vietnam and Iraq, should never have been fought. 2 out of 5, that should give us pause. And so we need to be much more careful about initiating these operations. One way to cool hawkish minds is to actually think through what the exit strategy would look like if things go wrong before we begin the war. And an analogy for this is, if any of you are intending to have a quick-fire marriage in Las Vegas, some of you may be intending to, I would encourage you to spend a few weeks sitting in the divorce courts, watching the marital exit strategies unfold. And that process, seeing the difficulty by which marriages end, may make you think twice about the wisdom of rushing off to Las Vegas and beginning this union. And in a similar vein, contemplating the difficulties of withdrawing the United States from a tough campaign, I think is a very useful thought exercise before we get in, and may cause even the most bellicose leader to think before he acts, which is also, by the way, the slogan of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dom. We're open for questions. I think we have someone going around with Tamar going around with the microphone, so please direct your question directly into the microphone. Bob Friedman over there.
It seems to me there's some cause for optimism, Dom, in what you've said, because if 90% of these wars are civil wars, that's extremely different from, let's say, World War II, which was involving Nazi and Japanese aggression against other countries. So in that sense, the battlefield, the area where there's conflict, is much more constrained, and therefore less need for us to be involved and less danger to others. So the one question that you've averted to is, why not just let them fight it out? In one of your prior books, your dissertation on the Spanish Civil War, the United States was, Roosevelt was very conflicted, according in your story, about exactly what to do. But the bottom line is, there were some American volunteers that fought, but basically we stayed, as a country, we stayed neutral, even though a lot of people sympathized with one side or the other. And I wonder whether today it's possible to remain neutral, even though large portions of the American public might be very sympathetic to one side or another. It's a political trick to resist the temptation to intervene when a lot of your constituents want you to do that.
Well, thank you very much for that, that analysis. The Spanish Civil War, interestingly, is in many ways a model for the current war in Syria. Highly divided country, foreign fighters, international intervention from many actors. There are all kinds of fascinating parallels. People have forgotten the Spanish Civil War apart from, say, Ernest Hemingway writing his novel. 3,000 Americans traveled to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, to fight for the left-wing government in Spain. It's actually a fascinating story with some interesting parallels. So let me just say two things in response. One is that you're absolutely right. So this transition away from interstate war towards civil war, it's led to kind of a paradoxical world that we live in, which is that in many ways it's a wonderful world to live in. Okay, great powers haven't fought each other since World War II or Korea, depending on how you define a great power. So this is a marvelous story. We should be cracking the champagne open, right? The interstate wars in America's golden age were often catastrophically bloody. World War II, hundreds of thousands of Americans killed. The Civil War, 750,000 Americans killed. These were terrible, terrible wars. The fact that these wars have largely declined is a fantastic story, right? And globalization, democracy, the UN, nuclear weapons, whatever combination of factors has led to this wonderful tale. But as the tide of interstate war receded, the conflicts that we're left with are these intractable civil wars. These are kind of the remnants of war that we have left. And it's in those wars that the US has struggled. So we live in a world of peace and American military loss. I don't want to go back to the golden age of American victories, because that was an age in which hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed. Right? Nevertheless, it was also an age of victory. Right? So that is the paradox. And you're absolutely right that we need more restraint. The US is too quick to seize the sword, as I mentioned. Nevertheless, there are situations in which the United States should be willing to use force. I think ISIS would pass that threshold after a careful calculation of American interests, American values, the costs of not acting, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that the war against ISIS, for example, passes that test. And there are occasions where the US did not act and should have. I think the Rwandan genocide would be an instance where the US could have saved a great number of lives at low cost. But the general story is one where the US has been too eager to military intervene, driven by its immense power, and more restraint would be in US interest.
Jean-Louis Wachowski?
Yeah. Thanks a lot for this brilliant presentation. I was wondering if you could help us understand the contrast between the first Iraqi war, the invasion of Kuwait, its planning, its execution, its termination,
yep,
and contrast that with the subsequent planning, execution, and withdrawal of subsequent wars in that region.
Sure.
Thank you.
So the US has fought two wars against Iraq, 1991 and then the 2003 war. And these wars were starkly different. The first, in 1991, is America's single success in major wars since World War II. The US liberated Kuwait at very low military cost for the United States. And the US acted by building a broad alliance, gaining UN support. The Soviets even tacitly went along with the operation. And in many ways, it was just an incredible textbook example of international diplomacy by the George H.W. Bush administration, which I think is one of the most skilled administrations in its foreign policy that we've seen in the last century. One of the pieces of credit I would like to give to Bush is that he ended the war with a limited success. In other words, he did not march on Baghdad. And he did this in spite of popular support in the United States for a crusade against Saddam Hussein. So during the war, opinion polls asked Americans, should we stop the war liberating Kuwait, or should we march on Baghdad, overthrow Saddam Hussein? over 70% of Americans said march on Baghdad. Because in the context of the war, Americans bought into this crusading vision where Saddam Hussein was Hitler #2. But George H.W. Bush, to his credit, saw that marching on Baghdad would be strategically very risky. Saddam might use chemical weapons in a last-ditch defense. The US alliance would disintegrate because many allies would not have gone along with this. And of course, we would then be burdened with occupying Iraq. But his choice was not popular with Americans. After the war ended, polls asked Americans, do you consider the Gulf War a victory? Most said no, because Saddam Hussein remains in power. So George H.W. Bush got remarkably little credit for the victory. Remember, he lost the election shortly afterwards to Bill Clinton. 2003, of course, we don't need to run through the many different failures of the thinking behind the war, both in its initiation and its planning. But obviously the most striking one was if we contrast H.W. Bush's thinking about the end game and overarching strategy and taking the limited victory and going home, we can contrast that with George W. Bush administration's lack of thought about the end game in Iraq and failure to plan for what was going to come after Saddam fell. The focus was all on the regime change phase and very little planning for the post-Saddam Hussein phase. Why didn't they plan for it? Well, partly it was overconfidence. We're going to be greeted as liberators, et cetera, et cetera. They'll throw flowers at us, therefore we don't need to plan. And partly because the George W. Bush administration just didn't want to do any nation building. So their way out of this dilemma, they wanted to do regime change, they didn't want to do nation building, was we won't need to do any nation building, we can just go home. Well, it didn't work out like that. So I think the contrast between the two wars is very revealing, but just to pick up that one point would be the clarity of strategic thinking about the end game in '91 versus the absence of strategic thinking in 2003.
But isn't it true to say that George Bush Sr. also determined that it was wise enough to weaken the Iraqi military so that it would no longer be a threat to the outside world, but strong enough to maintain order inside Iraq? Would it be true to say that?
That kind of logic may well have entered his thinking, and also a kind of very realist or realpolitik logic that Saddam Hussein would be a buffer against Iran. So I think that was part of the thinking, but in addition to the factors I mentioned, the lack of Allied support, the difficulties of running a post-Saddam Iraq, and the potential costs of marching on Baghdad, all entered his sort of strategic calculus. But the clarity of his thinking was very different from his son's.
We'll go to Louis Padullo and then Ambassador Adrian Basora in the back there.
The idea of planning your war so that you've got the end, the fire escape built out, that's so anti-military. Basically, I remember hearing Graneri talk about World War I, where every one of the great powers absolutely thought they were going to win. You don't go into it if you think you're going to lose. Past great generals, burned the boats on the beach, so the guys have nothing to do but march on to victory. So I think what you really want to do is think of a new definition of winning. If you have to go into an armed conflict, what would constitute in your mind this sort of minimally viable victory? Would it be just to sort of get the capital evacuated? Would it be, you have to come up like that, and then so you can start winning some. Anyway.
I think that's a good observation. And to pick up on the last point first, you're absolutely right that we need to think very clearly about what the goals of the war are before we begin. There was enormous haziness, for example, when we intervened in Afghanistan about what does the new Afghanistan look like? What exactly are we trying to build here? Again, this failure of, to think through the long term, to think through the end game. And I would encourage the US to be fundamentally pragmatic about what that end result is going to look like. For instance, in Afghanistan, we're not going to create a beacon of freedom, right? In a country where the literacy rate in Afghanistan today is lower than it was in America in 1650, right? So you're not going to create a Western-style democracy. We need to be pragmatic from the get-go. But American presidents are very given to grand rhetoric of freedom, et cetera, et cetera. And you're absolutely right with the first point as well, that the US military does not like to think about failure. it is a very, very much an institution driven by success, achieve the mission. But you have to wonder, right, when you have war after war after war turning into an unwinnable conflict where we desperately have to dial down the goals and find a way out. Perhaps before we start the next war, we could do some thinking about different off-ramps before we begin. It doesn't mean, of course, that would be the only planning process, right? The core plan would still be the plan to achieve your goals, even if they're pragmatic. But I would like to see more attention to what would be those contingencies. But the US military is very resistant to doing that. And in fact, in the book, I talk about some of the war games that took place before the invasion of Iraq. And one of them is absolutely amazing story. The US basically war gamed out the invasion of Iraq. It wasn't called Iraq, but that was basically what it was. And they chose a retired general to play the Saddam Hussein opponent. Well, this retired general turned out to be a very wily character. And when the US invasion fleet gathered, he surrounded it with speedboats, which turned out to be suicide bombers, and right at the start of the war did a preemptive strike that sunk most of the US fleet. The result was worse than Pearl Harbor. Luckily, it was just a war game. So at this point, the US military had a chance to think through what they would do if things went wrong in a war against Iraq. But that's not what they did. Instead, they stopped the game. They rose the fleet from its watery grave, right? Recreated it. And then they told the wily Saddam general that he had to reveal where his units were so American forces could land safely. Well, the general just quit the game in protest, saying the whole thing was a setup to allow an American victory. The US military got the victory that it wanted to show that it could easily defeat Saddam Hussein. So this culture of winning and refusing to think about failure, I think, is potentially very dangerous. And there has to be a way to weave it into the planning without becoming defeatist, right? There has to be a way to sort of balance the positive focus on the mission with some consideration of contingency operations, certainly more than we have now. But it's an excellent question.
Dominic, you mentioned that you interviewed General McChrystal, and I believe you interviewed some other key generals. Did you try out these ideas of planning for failure on them, and what did they say?
So most of the time I was just asking them questions, right? You don't, when you get to interview someone like McChrystal, you don't sort of say, okay, McChrystal, let me tell you my thoughts on war, right? I think the phone would go dead very quickly, right? I'm interested in what he thinks much more than what I think. But I did talk to James Stavridis, who's now head of Tufts, but used to be Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, which, by the way, is a wonderful title, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And he is a fascinating character, a poet, a writer, as well as a naval general, commander and Supreme Allied Commander. And he was very open to this idea of needing to do more planning for failure. And in fact, he said the military is far too focused on success. He quoted to me something that Colin Powell said, perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. That was one of Colin Powell's great mottos. Perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. That's a very American thing, right? And perpetual optimism is often good. Sometimes, however, it can be catastrophic, right? And so Stavridis was very interested in these ideas of thinking through contingencies. And what he suggested is that military schools should do much more serious analysis of failed operations. Look at what went wrong, understand it, as opposed to just buying into this idea that the military will always win. And that shouldn't be very difficult because we have quite a few recent cases that we could look at. Okay, so there's got to be a way to reconcile this kind of contingency planning with the American culture, which is very optimistic, can-do, mission accomplished type of way of thinking.
Ambassador Adrian Basora.
Thanks for a great presentation. I just want to make one comment before I ask my question. Since I was at the National Security Council during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, the successful one, and the planning is every bit what you said and what you know from your research. But one additional factor, one of the reasons that the war was stopped when it was, before entering  was the killing field, the fact that the Iraqi forces, Saddam Hussein's forces, were retreating in disarray. We had total superiority in the air and every other way. It would have been an absolute slaughter.
Yep.
You said wars should be legal. George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft, whom I worked for,
Yep.
felt the same way. We had a UN mandate.
Yep.
The UN mandate was not to remove, it was to withdraw,
Correct.
it was to push back the aggression against Kuwait and the potential aggression against Saudi Arabia that Saddam seemed to be planning. So I couldn't agree with you more on your comments about the, what does that mean? Oh, I'm going too long? All right, so the question is about Ukraine.
Yep.
The question is about something that is neither civil war or interstate war, as it's currently being defined, erroneously in my view. It's what's called hybrid war, or what is now being called hybrid war. Stavridis, I share your admiration for him, at a conference that I attended just last week, at the end of last week, said we should arm the Ukrainian military, not because to enable them to defeat the Russian military, but to create much more than the current speed bump. In other words, we should make it very costly for Putin to carry out the military side of his multi-pronged hybrid warfare. So your comments, I would like, in view of the doctrine and the careful analysis that you've laid out, how do you apply this to the current situation in Ukraine? Thanks.
So yeah, you're absolutely right to mention, just in the comments on the Gulf War, the highway of death, I think it was called, these retreating Iraqi forces, and I think that did factor in to the thinking as well, and pushed the administration, I think, into a wise act of restraint, even if it was very unsatisfying for many Americans in 1991. They were hoping for a kind of battleship Missouri, Tokyo Bay kind of surrender ceremony. Ukraine is a extremely difficult, not the only one of many extremely difficult challenges that the U.S. faces. Of course, this is in Russia's backyard, and the equivalent would be, it's not an exact analogy, but the equivalent would be a civil war taking place in Canada, right? And Russia thinking about potential intervention. This would be America's backyard, and America would have a huge strategic advantage. In Ukraine, am I defining it as a civil war? Absolutely. There's no question Ukraine is a civil war, in the sense that it would meet our academic threshold in terms of number of casualties and so on. Although the insurgency or the opposition in Ukraine has clearly been motivated, supported, perhaps even just directed by Russia. In other words, I'm in no way minimizing Russia's responsibility for the insurgency. There is within that opposition coalition, which includes clearly many Russian soldiers, indigenous elements as well. And there are sufficient of these indigenous elements that this would qualify as a civil war. That in no way diminishes Russia's responsibility. Without Russia, there wouldn't be an armed conflict, a civil war happening there. And it's a very complex conflict, as you say, a hybrid war which combines aspects of conventional fighting with aspects of guerrilla fighting, a civil war with international intervention. So exactly how much the US should intervene is a very interesting question, and I don't have an obvious answer other than to say that there is a very calibrated scale of intervention. There are not just sort of 3 or 4 notches. Really, there are 1,000 different notches in terms of precisely which kind of weapon systems we deliver. What kind of body armor we send? Do we send armored personnel carriers? Do we send machine guns? Do we send missiles? There is we can calibrate that precisely. My concern, however, about using this as a coercive tool, in other words, we move up and down this ladder of escalation and to raise the cost for Putin, is that there is an enormous mismatch in terms of interests. For the United States, Ukraine is a significant interest, but one among many. For Russia, it is the #1 interest. So that asymmetry of interest means that Putin would pay a very great price to ensure there is no defeat in Ukraine for Putin. I don't think he's necessarily set on conquering Ukraine, but he would certainly pay an enormous price to avoid a rout of his allied forces. And so we must always bear in mind that asymmetry of interest, the price we will pay to achieve our goals is far lower than the price Putin would pay. He would happily sacrifice Russian interests elsewhere that we would consider quite significant for the number one interest, which is Ukraine. Nevertheless, even given that qualifier, that Russia will always seek, will show greater will, really, in Ukraine than the United States, and will match any US escalation, or more than match it, quite easily. It may still be appropriate to move somewhat slowly but steadily, incrementally, up this ladder of aid. And there may also be other strategies we can do. Ukraine faces very severe financial problems. Why can't the US do more to ensure that Ukraine gets loans, et cetera, at favorable terms that will allow Ukraine to stabilize its economy and will also allow the regime potentially to buy some of the weapons and material it needs on the world market? So there are options short of a very provocative escalation. But we need to be aware here that the best case scenario in Ukraine is not going to look like a decisive US victory anytime soon, principally because of the asymmetry of interests.
Okay, gentleman in the back.
How do you square the strategy of surge, talk, and leave with the rise of ideological or radicalism, fundamentalism in the Middle East? And I think rather than focus on maybe ISIS or something, my analogy would be something in the home. So if the Americans for Tax Reform were the insurgency led by Grover Norquist, and their result is binary. You raise taxes, you lower taxes. So you surge, you fight, maybe you weaken them, and then you try to talk. There is no room for negotiation. It's yes or no.
Yep.
So then how do you then craft a leave after there is no talk?
Sure. So one of the themes that I sort of stressed is that the U.S. needs to embrace negotiation as a critical tool. This is not a kind of a weak liberal position. Henry Kissinger, for instance, was someone who said that Americans often see negotiation as weakness, but he saw it as a critical strategic tactic that you could use to achieve America's goals and protect its interests. We can't always talk, though. We can't always negotiate. Some adversaries are beyond the pale, so to speak. The Nazis would be an example. ISIS seems to be another example, that you cannot negotiate with them because they are so utterly extreme and so unwilling to compromise that negotiation is futile. But those are exceptions. The vast majority of opponents that the United States has faced, faces today and will face, are opponents where there is some room for accommodation and deal-making, especially in a situation where a war has gone off the rails and we can't win. After all, what is the alternative? The Taliban, I think we can negotiate over time a practical solution with. We should have done it a long time ago. The insurgents in Iraq, these Sunnis were killing Americans for years, and then in 2006, 2007, we put them on the American payroll at $300 a month. Well, that turned out to be an amazingly smart strategic move because they turned around and started killing al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were exceptionally skilled at doing this because they'd been shooting against Americans for many years, and they knew who the remaining insurgents were. So if we are willing to put on the payroll insurgents who had just been killing American soldiers days or weeks before, and we look at that and think that was a very smart strategic move in a very difficult campaign, then it shows that there is considerable room for the tool of negotiation and engagement, even in what would seem to be morally dubious and strategically questionable circumstances. But you're absolutely right to say that there are situations where you can't do that. And in the war against ISIS, I don't see any room for negotiating with ISIS. I think the negotiation would happen with other actors in the region, including some actors that may be very far removed from American values.
I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. It's 6:30, unfortunately. Join me in thanking Dom Tierney.